When he wrapped his arms around my waist, I felt the firmness of his embrace. Even so, there was a calmness in the way he held me, almost as though he wanted to remind me that it was as real as it was delicate. The exchange of glances between one kiss and another spoke more than words. There was a pulsing desire, yet also mutual respect and care. The world around us remained still, and in that brief moment in time, all that existed was the warmth of his body against mine, the subtle trace of each touch, and the constant shiver that ran through us whenever our eyes met again. It no longer mattered if anyone could see, if there were judgments out there. In that room, for a few moments, we belonged to each other. I'm going to tell you how it happened. It was a quiet afternoon when I decided to stop by Luke's house. We'd been childhood friends, practically knowing each other since we started walking. My relationship with him was always easygoing, without pressure, with those relaxed chats about anything, from the latest show we were watching to our frustrations with adult life. The door was ajar when I arrived. I knocked softly, but no one answered, so I went in with the ease of someone who already knows the place well. Luke's house had always had a peculiar atmosphere. There was something about it that made me feel an indescribable calm, as if upon entering I could be who I really am, with no need for masks or worries. "Hi, Mum," I shouted, more out of politeness, since the house had always been a meeting point for us where she spent most of her time. The living room was empty, but I soon heard a familiar voice coming from the kitchen. "Hi, son. Your friend's in the usual room." The voice was gentle, yet it carried a certain lightness I'd always associated with the coziness of Luke's house. His dad, Marcus, was there, always so present, always so serene, but with an energy that somehow seemed to know everything going on around him, without needing to say much. I headed towards Luke's room, but before I reached the door, something made me pause. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen, and there he was, Marcus, leaning against the counter with that smile of someone who knows the secrets of every corner of the house but never gives them away. We looked at each other for a moment. Marcus was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it felt as though the whole world lined up to listen. His eyes were fixed on something, yet it was as if, at the same time, he was addressing me, or maybe the silence between us. "It's good to see you here," he said with a calm smile, the same smile as always. The lightness of his words made me relax straight away. He had his hand on the coffee as though it were only natural to share that moment. Deep down, his presence always gave me a strange, not unpleasant discomfort, but something about him stirred a part of me I couldn't fully grasp. "Is Luke in his room?" I asked, looking away so I didn't seem like I was drawing that moment out. I knew the answer would be yes, but there was something different about the exchange. "He is indeed," he said without taking his eyes off me. "But there's no rush. Make yourself at home." There was something in that "make yourself at home" that made me feel as though the house, and more than that, the moment, belonged to him as well, and maybe to me. The place was charged with something delicate, an energy that flowed into every corner. I paused for a moment. I didn't want to leave, but I didn't know if I could stay there so casually either. I already knew the house, the life, the ways of everyone who lived there. But he, Marcus, had something that made any simple encounter more. I went to Luke's room, but Marcus's presence stayed with me. His smile, the way he seemed in tune with the moment, as though he had something more to share but no urgency to do so. Later on, with Luke on the sofa, talking about the films we'd watched in the last few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about Marcus. He was always around, yet in a way that felt more like a pleasant shadow without having to speak at all. As the night went on, our conversation flowed naturally, but I noticed that Marcus wasn't distant. I felt him there somehow, observing, understanding, and perhaps waiting for something. I'm not sure what, but I sensed it. The tension was subtle, and our exchanged glances were no longer casual. Each smile, each gesture felt like an invitation to a game I didn't fully understand. Part of me wanted to figure it out, but the complexity of it made me hesitate. Leave me alone, I thought, but it was clear that something between Marcus and me was growing. Before continuing with this engrossing story, I wanted to ask, are you enjoying this narrative? Do you feel the tension and the connection between the characters growing? If so, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is really important so we can bring you many more intense stories like this one. The more you support us, the more we can create and share with you. So go ahead and subscribe now so you don't miss the best of When No One Is Looking. Let's carry on. It was already night when Luke and I decided to go out for a stroll around town. Marcus was at the back of the house busy with something I didn't bother to find out. Still, the memory of his presence in the kitchen wouldn't leave me. And then, without meaning to, I found myself heading to where he was. as if I couldn't avoid it. He was on the veranda, a drink in his hands, looking at the street. He didn't look at me straight away, but I felt an increasing urge to get closer. The tension seemed to pulse in the air, and without words I sat down beside him. Nothing too significant, yet everything there seemed to have its own rhythm. "How are you?" he asked, breaking the silence. But the way he did it made me feel that somehow he knew what I was thinking, or perhaps he was waiting for me to say something more. "Fine," I said, though the word hung empty in the air. I wanted to say something else, something that made sense to me and to him. "And you?" He just smiled in a mysterious way, as if words were unnecessary. Our conversation flowed naturally, but there was an implicit invitation in everything, in the touch of his hand passing the drink to me, in the slight way he leaned towards me, yet always unhurried, never forcing anything. All of that made me feel a silent, growing attraction. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I sensed he wanted something more, but without any rush. Perhaps even the same curiosity I felt. Night stretched on, and the distance between us seemed to shrink more and more, without the need for any direct move. I knew something would happen, but I didn't know what. I stood up to leave, but he looked at me with those eyes that seemed to say everything his words hadn't said yet. And in that look, laden with something beyond what words could express, I realized there was more between us, more than I was prepared to understand at that moment. We said goodbye with a smile that seemed to carry the promise of something yet to come, but the future was uncertain. The desire was there, but the words had not yet been spoken. What would happen next? That I still didn't know. It was late when, after a long day of conversations and glances, I realized that things between us had changed. Marcus and I were on the veranda again, the distant sounds of the city fading and the open sky reflecting a gentle moon. He was closer now, almost close enough for me to feel the energy between us. He looked at me in a different way, as though he wanted to tell me something without words, and I knew in that moment the silence spoke louder than anything. Nothing was said, but with one longer exchange of glances I felt something in the air, a tension growing quietly as though the desire was ripening slowly between us. Just one subtle touch of his hand on mine, a gesture almost imperceptible, was enough for me to understand that he wanted more, and I, wordless, unhurried, began to realize that perhaps that night was the start of something that, until then, had never been so clear. The night was silent. The only thing to be heard was the soft sound of our breathing, fractured by our growing closeness. I was standing just inches away from Marcus, and the atmosphere around us was charged with the tension that could no longer be ignored. There was no need for words anymore. What existed between the two of us was something much deeper, something that could only be understood through gestures, touches, and the exchange of glances. He moved closer slowly, as though waiting for my permission, never forcing anything. His fingers brushed along my arm in such a subtle way it made my skin tingle. The feeling of his hand on me with that light touch seemed to say everything words could never express. I knew he was there, in that moment, as vulnerable as I was. The tension was palpable, yet it was also comforting, as though we were both guided by some invisible force. His gaze fixed on me held an intensity that took my breath away. He leaned in slightly as if about to take the initiative, but instead he did something even more surprising. He brought his face close to mine, his lips almost touching mine, but just remaining there, on the edge, as if he wanted to prolong the moment, savor the anticipation. I could feel his warmth, that light scent he wore mingling with my breath. The weight was agonizing, yet delicious. Then he finally touched his lips to mine, at first delicately, a gentle, slow exchange, yet full of meaning. The way he touched me, how his fingers slid across my skin, made me feel as though the rest of the world had vanished. There was nothing else but him and me in that space, in that moment of pure surrender. That moment. His hands began to explore with more confidence, drawing me in softly, as though inviting me not to resist. Every movement he made caused my heart to beat faster, and every sigh escaping our lips heightened the intensity of that silent exchange. When he took me in his arms, I felt his strength but also his tenderness. There was no rush. It was simply the desire to be there, in that space, with him. His touch on my skin, the way he held me, everything flowed naturally, without haste. I surrendered, letting the tension and the desire take over me, as if we were both guided by a melody only the two of us could hear. The warmth between us was growing, but what truly moved me was the calm he radiated. Even in our surrender, there was something serene and profound in the way he touched me, as if he knew everything was happening in its own time, at the perfect moment. And in that instant, there was no longer any room for doubts or fears, only the now, only the energy passing between us. I was leaving the bedroom, still somewhat stunned by what had just happened. The feeling of having given myself over to that moment, to that unexpected passion, was mixing with the discomfort of knowing Luke might be nearby. I was walking towards the door when suddenly, I heard the sound of a door opening. Seeing Luke standing in the doorway, the look on his face hit me like a punch in the stomach. He looked at me with visible anger, his eyes narrow, and for the first time I noticed the intensity of his pain. He was clearly shaken. "You," he began, but couldn't finish. The anger in his voice was almost bursting out. I tried to take a deep breath, feeling embarrassed. I knew there was no simple explanation for what had just happened. The weight of his gaze was too much to bear, and all I wanted at that moment was to vanish, but I knew I couldn't. "Luke," I began, my voice trembling, not really sure what to say. I didn't. I know it looks wrong, but I gave in. It wasn't something planned, nor something I expected, but it happened, and I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." He remained silent, but his anger didn't fade. He stared at me for a few more seconds before letting out a deep sigh. You're apologizing?" he said, his voice still full of tension. "I don't understand. I was angry because you were with him, with my dad." I felt my heart tighten. The anger he felt wasn't just about what I'd done. There was something deeper there, something I hadn't realized. "Luke, I began, but he lifted his hand, cutting me off. "No, you don't understand," as he exclaimed. I was angry because I wanted to be in your place. I wanted it to be me, not him." I stood there, not knowing how to react. The shock was immediate, and I couldn't hide my surprise. Luke, my best friend, was confessing something I would never have imagined hearing. He was jealous? He wanted to be with me? Silence took over the room, and that was when something inside me broke. I moved towards Luke slowly, feeling the weight of the tension between us, but also something new, something I could no longer ignore. Confusion, desire, tension, all of it mixing, and without thinking I took a step forward and kissed him. The kiss was gentle, yet filled with meaning. Luke didn't pull away. On the contrary, he responded to the kiss with an intensity that made me realize that perhaps both of us were more connected than we'd imagined. He pulled me closer, his arms wrapping around me with a need that couldn't be ignored. The tension was still there, but now there was something else. Something that might be the start of something new. Something no one expected, but somehow felt as natural as what had already happened between us. And without a word, we headed to the bedroom.
Comment below what you would do in their place. Would you fight it, hide your desires, or give in completely? If you enjoyed it, like and share it when no one's looking. And don't forget, betraying us is not subscribing to the channel.